Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the neuroscience of lasting transformation. And I am so thrilled to have you here because we are going to tear down pretty much everything we've been taught about willpower, discipline, and personal change. You know how we've all been sold this idea that if you just push a little harder, if you just want it bad enough, you can totally reinvent yourself? Well, scratch that. We are going to look strictly at what peer-reviewed psychology and neuroscience actually tell us about why we stay stuck and how we actually change. It's going to be a fascinating ride.
So let's just get right into it. Why is it that some people can completely transform their health, their careers, literally their entire sense of self, while others just stay trapped in the exact same patterns for decades? It is so incredibly tempting to just throw out one word, willpower, right? Or maybe discipline. We constantly tell ourselves that being stuck is simply a lack of motivation. But I really want to validate any frustration you've had with failed goals in the past. Look, most people who fail to change, they do not fail because they lack motivation. They fail because motivation was actually never the engine that drives real transformation in the first place.
It turns out, psychological research consistently shows us that change tied to who you believe you are lasts way, way longer than change tied to some fleeting goal. Think about it. Saying, I'm trying to exercise more, that's just a temporary project. It requires you to constantly actively choose to act. But saying, I'm someone who trains, is an identity. It's a fundamental fact about who you are, and your future behavior naturally just wants to stay consistent with that fact. Real change doesn't start with a to-do list. It requires a fundamental shift in who you actually believe you are. And this really hits the nail on the head as to why relying on motivation is an absolute trap. At the end of the day, motivation is just a feeling. And feelings, well, they're incredibly unreliable by design. They go up and down with your sleep, how stressed you are, your blood sugar, and like 100 other random variables that have absolutely nothing to do with your actual long-term goals. If you've struggled with this before, please hear this. Building a massive life transformation on top of motivation is literally like building a house on a shifting tide. Sure, it might hold up for a few days, but that ground was never, ever going to stay still. Okay, so if motivation is a bust, what actually works? Well, we have to look at the literal physical architecture of your brain. Let's talk about neuroplasticity. This is your brain's amazing capacity to physically reorganize itself based on repeated experience. Every single time you repeat a thought or a behavior, or even a specific way of reacting to stress, the neural pathway for that action gets physically reinforced in your brain. Do it enough times, and it stops requiring conscious effort. It just becomes automatic. Habits aren't just these abstract, floaty ideas. They are literally built into the physical wiring of your brain through sheer repetition. Now, this physical reality totally debunks one of the absolute biggest myths in all of self-improvement. We constantly hear about dopamine, right? Everyone calls it the pleasure chemical. But in the world of actual neuroscience, dopamine is a signal tied to prediction and pursuit. It's about anticipation. Over time, your brain actually learns to release dopamine in anticipation of a reward, not just when you finally get the reward. This is exactly why a specific trigger, maybe a stressful email from your boss, or even just walking past a familiar street corner, can trigger an old bad habit before you've even consciously decided to do it. Your brain is already anticipating what comes next. So, why is it so incredibly hard to break those old patterns once they're wired in? Daniel Kahneman's famous research on loss aversion reveals something truly fascinating. He found that people feel the pain of a loss roughly twice as intensely as the pleasure of an equivalent gain. Think about that for a second. Your brain doesn't look at a shiny new healthy habit and objectively weigh the pros and cons. No way. It looks at what it has to give up, and it heavily, heavily penalizes that loss. So the absolutely crucial point here is this. Leaving the familiar registers psychologically as a loss. Your brain evaluates the discomfort of leaving that old, familiar version of you behind, and that discomfort gets weighted far, far more heavily than the incredible benefits of whatever you're moving toward. This completely explains why so many of us stay in unfulfilling careers or toxic relationships or just hold on to negative self-images. It's not because we can't see that there are better options out there. It's because the act of letting go of our current reality triggers a massive, blaring psychological alarm bell in our heads. Let's ground all this neuroscience in actual human behavior. You might be familiar with Carol Dweck's highly cited Stanford research. Dweck found that praising effort, saying things like, you worked really hard on that, actually builds resilience. Students who heard that were way more willing to tackle harder challenges later on. But praising innate ability, saying something like, wow, you're so smart, that actually created a deep fear of failure. Students praised for their intelligence started avoiding difficulty altogether just to protect their new identity as the smart one. They literally didn't want to risk looking dumb. But look, human behavior is always nuanced, and even well-established psychology deserves scrutiny, not just blind repetition. We have to be intellectually honest here. Later attempts to replicate parts of Dweck's research have actually produced some mixed results. Even Dweck herself has warned against the oversimplified versions of her ideas that get tossed around in schools. Because in this explainer, we are committed to peer-reviewed reality, not just catchy pop psych tropes. The core takeaway about effort is still super valuable, but the actual science, it's always a bit more intricate than a bumper sticker. Which brings us to Viktor Frankl. He was a psychiatrist and a survivor of the Holocaust, and he famously wrote, "The one thing that can't be taken from a person is the choice of how to respond to circumstance." Coming from one of the most extreme, horrifying environments imaginable, Frankl observed something profound. It's meaning, not comfort, that sustains people through profound transformation. Change is never about avoiding hardship, it's about finding the underlying meaning that actually allows you to push through it. All right, so we've covered the common illusions, the hardcore neuroscience, and the psychology. Now, let's put it all together into the transformation framework. I'm going to outline the specific, daily mechanisms you need to successfully rewire your brain. We're taking everything we just learned and turning it from theory into something you can literally start using today. Let's get into it. Step 1. Design your environment before relying on willpower. As we've established, willpower is a highly depletable resource. It's like a battery. It weakens as the day goes on. So instead of trying to just white-knuckle your way through temptation, change your environment. Remove the triggers for your old patterns entirely. Or, on the flip side, place the cues for your new habits somewhere completely impossible to ignore. A deliberately designed environment beats sheer determination hands down, every single time. Step 2. Use small, deliberate repetition instead of some dramatic overnight overhaul. Remember our chat about neuroplasticity? Neural pathways strengthen through tiny, consistent daily actions. They do not strengthen through one single, incredibly ambitious, exhausting day where you try to fix your whole life at once. Honestly, a 5-minute habit repeated daily reshapes your brain's physical architecture far more reliably than some 3-hour marathon you only attempt once and then immediately give up on. Step 3. Reframe the discomfort of change as information, not danger. When you start a new habit, it is going to feel uncomfortable. That departure from the familiar will always feel a bit threatening. But now you know, thanks to Kahneman's research, but this is just a totally predictable psychological reflex. It is not a sign that you're failing, and it is certainly not a signal to quit. It is literally just your brain doing exactly what it evolved to do. Acknowledge it and keep going. Step 4. Protect your sleep and reduce decision fatigue. You absolutely cannot rewire your brain if you don't give it the physical resources to do so. Memory consolidation and the actual physical neural reinforcement of these new patterns happen substantially while you're asleep. Plus, every single choice you make throughout the day draws from the exact same limited cognitive resource. If you're exhausted and overwhelmed by 1,000 tiny decisions, you just won't have the cognitive energy left to enforce that new identity. Okay, so we have the framework. The science is laid out perfectly right in front of us. But we need to face a final reality check here. If all of this is so well understood by science, why does lasting personal transformation remain so incredibly rare? Seriously, if we have the blueprint, why is it still so deeply difficult for us to change? Well, the answers are both biological and social. First, your brain is hardwired to prioritize instant gratification over distant, long-term goals. And as we've learned, the fear of change triggers a very real, very physical sense of psychological loss. Comfort zones provide this really powerful false sense of safety. But honestly, perhaps the biggest hidden trap of all is social friction. The people around you have built up their own expectations of who you are based on years of observing you. When you change your identity, you disrupt their reality. That causes immense social friction, which most of us vastly underestimate until we're standing right in the middle of it. Because of all this, I want to emphatically reframe something for you. Comfort zones aren't laziness. They're simply your brain's powerful desire for predictability and safety. If you failed at changing in the past, please let go of the guilt. Your brain heavily values safety and predictability, even when that predictable outcome is a life you don't actually want. It sounds crazy, but your brain is just trying to keep you safe from the great unknown. I really want you to remember that real, lasting change was never about just wanting it more. It was never about having a single morning of immense superhero-level willpower. Transformation is absolutely not a single leap. It happens only in the 1,000 ordinary repetitions that nobody else was watching. It is built the exact same way the brain builds everything else, quietly, deliberately, and compounding over time. The people who actually change their lives just understand that their quiet daily systems are the true engine of their new identity. So my final question for you to take away today is this. What is one ordinary 5-minute repetition you can start today that the future version of you will thank you for?